change are in sub-Saharan Africa. So on this session, we will discuss how to bridge the climate financing gap and make sure Africa gets the resources that it needs. How Africa's priorities are constantly on the global stage. How can instruments such as blended and concessional finance for climate action support African nations? And how can the role of the private sector be boosted in climate action financing in Africa? Please welcome our distinguished moderator for the session, Dr. Stephen Hammer, Senior Climate Policy Advisor, World Bank. Her Excellency Dr. Yasmin Farid, Egypt Minister of Environment, she will be joining us in a couple of minutes. Dr. Hanan Morsi, Deputy Executive Secretary, UNICA. Mr. Remy Rio, Chief Executive Officer, AFD. Mrs. Kanawani, Executive Vice President, Afrexim Bank, and Mrs. Nadia Hakansu, Managing Director for Africa, Siemens Egypt. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining today's session. If you were in this room just before, you heard about the role of the MDBs as the minister, and the role that one type of institution can play. The goal for this afternoon session is to really engage the policy community, to engage the finance community. Hello, how are you? In a conversation about how we address this funding gap that we heard about in the introductory comments. So, Minister, I can let you catch your breath if you'd like.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to start with Dr. Morsi then. Dr. Morsi, UNECA has had a long record of looking at how climate change has affected the African continent. And in August, you co-hosted an event with the Egyptian COP presidency where you invited ministers from across the continent to come share information about the level of finance needed and the challenges that they had in terms of accessing those resources. This is a situation, a conversation that was made all the more challenging by the lingering impacts of COVID on national economies, and then now the ripple effects this year of the war in Ukraine on energy prices and food security. So can you talk a bit about the key takeaways from that conversation and how we address three, very different but all expensive, crises? How do we take those on in a systematic way where we can achieve multiple goals at the same time?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. We had the honor of co-convening with the Egyptian government, the African Ministers of Finance meeting ahead of COP to actually discuss all these finance issues and come focused to the discussion here at COP27. As we have already heard throughout our days here at COP27, Africa in particular is a continent that contributes less than 3% of global emissions, yet it's the most vulnerable region to actually the consequences and the costs. And at the same time, it's a continent that also has been hit hard by, like many other low-income and middle-income countries, by a tsunami of global shocks. The cost of living crisis that is one generation type of, as we call in the UN. So this, at the same time, also the continent has been increasingly exposed to consequences of global warming in terms of extreme weather shocks. We've seen droughts that East Africa is really suffering from. We've seen droughts even in Morocco that is the worst in 40 years. We are seeing, hurricanes in the south, so we've been seeing really the impact on the ground of all what is happening. Yet, what is the issues here is the global system of climate finance has a lot of particular structural issues that need to be tackled. Of course, part of it is the issue that there need to be ways by which these countries that have not contributed to the problem and actually, in fact, contribute to the solution, because places like the peatlands of the Congo Basin can provide 30%, a third of the world needs in terms of sequestering. So not only is the continent a one that has not contributed much to the problem, but it's core part of the solution. So in terms of the discussions that we had in September, some of the things that came, and when we're talking today about solutions, some of the things that came out are the need for more grant financing, especially for all these countries that are highly vulnerable to these climate shocks and fragile. The need for more concessional financing to be available. And here there is a key role of MDBs. As we have, actually, I was just sitting for part of the earlier session, and that was the topic of the discussion. We need to have more involvement and more capital for MDBs to be able to support green financing through concessional financing means. But also, there are other instruments by which we can be further used, such as, for example, climate debt for climate swaps. And this is an area that really can help many of the countries, both not just when they are actually in the distress, but rather proactively and in advance to help them refinance expensive existing debt or go to the market with reasonable cost of borrowing, with some strong commitments toward climate change and nature. So these would be really important. And another area that came out is the need for more credit enhancement instruments. Things like, guarantees, for example, to help lower the cost of actually accessing the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister, we're going to come to you first off. We've been chatting for some months now, and it's exciting to be here. And I know that you and your government has been using that time for consultations like what Dr. Morsi was just mentioning, really trying to understand deeply kind of what the issues are, what the challenges are, and who must take action. So we've heard, again, prior conversations on the role of MDBs. One of the things I'm really interested in is kind of how your presidency is approaching the role of public sector, private sector, the role of domestic finance versus international finance as part of a comprehensive system that needs to fit together. And what do you see as the top priorities that your presidency is really trying to move the needle on over the next 12 months?
First of all, thank you very much for convening that gala, and welcome everyone being there on the Finance Day. First thing that the presidency is trying to see, how can pledges be fulfilled that came out from Glasgow. We don't want any kind of backsliding, and we don't want to be seen as not only Egypt presidency, but the whole climate change multilateral system as not being credible. At the time when the whole world itself is looking at the crisis and is this really a cup for implementation, yes or no? The issue of how you are looking at the private, the public, and the blended finance is not the issue that we would like to see as the main entry point to that. The whole system of the global finance response has to change in a way of, one, streamlining the process of how the financial mechanism serves mitigation and adaptation. Second, work closely on achieving the progress on the global goal on adaptation, because that solves a very important part in the equation of, are we doubling adaptation finances came from Glasgow? Okay, if we're doubling, how are countries, developing countries, least developed countries, accessing the finance for adaptation? If you don't have that goal, you will not be able simply to access the finance, even if you streamline that process. Thirdly, which is very important within the financial architecture, where does the NAP stand, the National Adaptation Plans? Countries were requested to develop their national adaptation plans. How are we converting those plans into investment opportunities? And here I'd like to showcase of Egypt. Over the last 12 months, here I'm getting out the hat of the COP envoy, I'm wearing the hat of being Egyptian Minister of Environment, is that we, together through a very condensed national interministerial own process, were able to develop a strategy for 2050, an updated NDC, a package of the first priority areas where we linked energy, water, and food. And this is in itself is a story to tell. Because the story is not only about a multi-stakeholder platform that gets out all the different partners together, but the story is that you're linking the energy, which is mitigation, bankable, to the water and food, which has always been the case within the financial mechanisms, that how are those bankable? So the questions of adaptation, NAPs, converted to investment plans. So if it's converted to investment plan, how can they be bankable? So if they are bankable, how can we access finance? You know, each of those questions lead to one another. So that is something, plus what I would say, the opportunity within the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market would still be something that we would like to look at on how best to change. Just quickly, the quick message is, we will not be looking as presidency as the finance and a global response within an architecture that looks alone on the 100 billion, progress on the new collective goal on finance. It cannot be like that. We have to link that to the global goal on adaptation, where will be the transparency in Article 6 and the carbon market, because that together with opportunities of global initiatives, of different case studies, of actual implementation, I think that would make something really meaningful that we can show to the world during our presidency. Thank you, Steve.
Great, thank you very much. And Remy, I'm going to come to you now. As the head of AFD, as the head of the International Development Finance Club as well, you played a really instrumental role and championed the role of public development banks as a key player in this architecture that's been described. And whether we're talking about capacity building, whether we're talking about translating NAPs into concrete investments, whether we're talking about accessing financial mechanisms, oftentimes the public development banks can play a role in any or all of those activities. So can you talk about what the vision has been, trying to bring them more to the front of this conversation, but also what you're seeing in terms of the prominence of those types of institutions in Africa, and does more need to be done? Do they need to change focus? Can you talk a bit about that as well?
Thanks a lot, Stephen, and thanks to the presidency, dear Minister Yasmin, for the invitation to share with you my own experience about Africa needs and access. My experience as the CEO of the French Development Agency, born in Africa back in 1941, and standing, of course, by the side of Africa, in France, in Europe, everywhere, advocating for what is happening in the region. And my first point is really to say, of course, there are needs, they are huge, they are measured, but there's also a lot of action happening in Africa for the fight against climate change. We just announced this morning the support from KfW and AFD to the JETP framework in South Africa. 600 million euros signed already, so it ignited, it started. And we know how committed the South African authorities and society as a whole is behind the just transition. We were yesterday with the Prime Minister, you Minister Rania Al-Mashat, to all support the Noafi plan that you set. We were with President Kagame for the Ireme Invest Fund. I mean, the transformation of the whole financial system in Kigali to make it green. The development bank, the central bank. A way to say that we are a sensor, a captor of what I feel as a deep resolve, and certainly what you, Stephen, are doing with this, the CCDR report that are so important to measure and regions are standing. You already published the CCDR for South Africa, if I'm right, and also the one on the Sahel region, which is so important. So we are here in Sharm el-Sheikh, proud and very on the ground, very concretely in African countries, and I want to really strongly disagree with all those, I'm hearing that from time to time, that oppose development and climate in Africa. This is not what I'm saying. I see in Africa, like in Europe, in each and every region in the world, a deep effort to combine and reconcile development needs and the fight against climate change. And I hope that this COP27 will help a new framework emerge that reconcile both. And my second remark, my other experience comes, yes, from my duty as the chair of the IDFC club. From IDFC, we launched this Finance in Common initiative to gather the whole family of public development banks. So IDFC, well, you heard Benedicto Rama, how convincing he is, and Kanayo Awani is here as well for Afreximbank. But as a member of IDFC, we have DBSA with our dear friend Patrick Lamini, we have Caisse des Dépôts et Gestion in Morocco, Khalid Safir, BOAD with Serge Ekwe, AFC with Soumaïla Soubarou. So just a few members, you know how valuable, how strong these institutions are, and really my work, what we are doing together is to try to organize this very vast community of 500 plus public development banks in the world, to have them turn to climate. I mean, IDFC is already $224 billion climate finance in 2021. When you add the multilateral development banks, you are over 300 billion. And if all the public banks would allocate only 20% of their financing to climate, it would make $500 billion. And probably we're not that far from that. So let's pay attention to this group, let's mobilize this group, not for itself. Jay is here, of course, to mobilize private finance, to mobilize their own ecosystem in their own country, so that we do more. So we were in Abidjan 2 weeks ago. All the public banks from Africa were there, 100 of them, only 1% of total assets. So there's a real issue to have these institutions recognized, empowered, to have them, to see them grow, so that they play the role of public development banks in their financial system, which is what is needed everywhere in the world, including in Africa. So I close by saying that I dream really of a seamless architecture with the buy-in of national institutions to support the whole system, with the capillarity to provide the last mile. Yes, to do more. And I hope we will be convincing enough, all of us, so that our shareholders, yes, are issuing more SDR, and hopefully allocate part of the SDR through MDBs to reach national development banks, so that we increase our firepower for climate and SDGs. That's on the supply side. And I want also to highlight the demand side. We need a machine that is able, because if the money is flowing and there's no project in front of these funds, we need also a machine that is able to originate way more quality projects than what we have today on the table. And this will not be done from Paris or from Washington or from Berlin. It has to be made on the ground from the local financial system, private and public as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And I want to turn now to everybody enjoyed what you just said quite a bit. I'm going to talk to Mrs. Kameo Awani about, Remy was just talking about the Just Transition announcement this morning. And one of the things that's been interesting for me is I've been paying more attention to the African finance issue over the course of this past year was the work that you've done, or your institution has done with the African Petroleum Producers Organization, trying to develop a new African energy transition facility or bank that's really trying to accelerate Africa's economic development, address the SDGs, but also focus on this broader notion of just transition. Now, to date, most of the just transition conversation has come in countries where coal is the dominant form of energy. You're partnering with the petroleum producers. That's not a partnership that we've heard much about that has been at the heart of this conversation. So how did that come about, and where is the conversation heading? And is it substantially different than what we're hearing in a South African JETP or another coal-intensive economy JETP type arrangement?
Thank you. Hello. Okay, this is better. So let me start by thanking you for having us on this panel, especially the government of Egypt. We're happy to have supported the government for this incredible program. Overall, I'll start with the rationale, and that rationale comes from the fact that Africa will account for about 600 million people who don't have access to electricity. And what that means is that unlike the people are inhibited, it also means that level of industrialization is challenged. The other issue is also the issue of the fact that, and that's something that we're saying all through this program, is that Africa has not carbonized, but rather we're the victims of carbonization. And as such, like you rightly said, we want to promote a just transition. And that's how that rationale came about to see. And again, that the fact that the continent will account about 400 or 500 trillion cubic feet of gas. And we think that, harnessing and exploiting that opportunity for a just transition, it will be in the best interest of the continent. And so, as a bank, we've been promoting adaptation. And part of that is the energy transition bank. Yes. Because, like I rightly said, Africa accounts for about 500 TCF of natural gas. We need to harness that to be able to support Africa's development as well. The lack of the electricity impoverishment affects livelihoods, our welfare, our well-being. It also affects the level of industrialization. So how does the continent industrialize, especially with not just coal, quite a number of fossil-dependent economies. We also looked at ourselves that because of the huge demand that we have now received, as the international capital retreating to support oil and gas interventions, we needed to do something about it in the interest of our continent. And that's how we decided to partner with the APO, the African Petroleum Producing Organization, to set up the Energy Transition Bank, which does a few things to restore and also leverage capital, to support African economies in the transition period. It's also to see how we can support the energy value chain, and also
leverage or to help mobilize funding. It's beyond that too. It's also to support African economies, to support them to diversify their dependency within and to also hedge, and to mitigate the cost of transition. So the way to look at it is more focused on adaptation, to see how we can support the economy, knowing that we are the low rung of development already, as the narratives around climate change, carbon markets, we are acutely aware that we are more the victims, and also a conversation around loss and damage is more useful. And that we're also working, aside from the Energy Transition Bank, the other programs that we have, to see how we can also ensure that we are properly compensated, maybe in the insurance market, to see how we are properly compensated for the loss and damages that we face on the continent at this time. I'll leave it there. We will also have other products. In the interest of time, maybe I'll give other people a chance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nadia, talking about the energy system transition or transformation that needs to occur, we have the example here in Egypt through the NUEFI program where closure of gas-fired facilities shift to renewables. As you're looking at the current landscape where you're anticipating things going in the next few years, how much is the market going to be moving on its own? And where are policy measures, innovations in the form of a NUEFI type platform going to be critical to accelerate that market shift? And what are going to be the key obstacles to actually make that a success in the time frame that increasingly we're hearing that needs to be done?
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me. Let's just first start that everyone is acutely aware of this situation, like with the energy poverty and the fact that 600 million people lack access to electricity. I think we have to start with acknowledging that this remains the key priority, right? To end energy poverty, to close the gap, to stimulate industrialization and socioeconomic growth of Africa, and that this transition also requires us to be pragmatic in terms of having clear energy roadmaps, energy development plans. I fully agree with the remarks made by the Honorable Minister. I fully agree with that. It needs to be implementable, right? Clear energy roadmaps, clear defined budgets that support that. And I always think in terms of 3 blocks. Technology is one area, policy and governance is another area, and financing obviously is a key area. Technology is not the issue, right? There's a variety of technologies, gas-powered solutions, that also is a key step, right? We have to start by moving away from fossil fuel in terms of coal, obviously. Natural gas is definitely, I agree to your point, a transitional fuel for those countries that do dispose of indigenous access to natural gas. And it's a wide palette of technology solutions, right? Wind, solar, obviously with the ample supply of renewable natural resources in Africa, it's obvious that this is going to play an important role. And the future potential I see for Africa is, of course, it becoming a green energy hub, right? That it can also not only facilitate and solve its own domestic, regional energy problem, but also support the global world in achieving its net zero targets. But let's acknowledge the fact that we have failed Africa, right? There were commitments in 2015, obviously the Paris Agreement, that the developed part of the world would support the emerging market and developing part of the world. But de facto, the actual investments into energy infrastructure and climate investment into emerging markets is marginal. And Africa in the next 2 decades would need 40 billion per year to close the gap, and about 1/3 of that actually goes into Africa.
So the financing element, the cost of capital, is what I capture also from heads of states and leaders in Africa, that the cost of capital is way too high. And obviously this is relating to perceptions, and of course the fact that there is risk aversion and perceptions of Africa and hesitation. But this is one key area, the cost of capital. I also agree with Dr. Hanan, your points about concessional loans is of course important. We should move away from only the perspective of aid and concessional loans, and also see how do we stimulate private investment. So what would a private investor or a private company want to see? Well, first of all, clear, transparent policies, because policy uncertainty is one of the key challenges. If the government is not outlining a clear policy that actually stimulates investment into energy and clean energy, private equity is not going to flow. There's going to be hesitation. So the government's obviously playing key roles in defining clear energy roadmaps, budgets. There's definite support from multilateral development banks such as AFD, also enabling and understanding the needs. And in the end of the day, bankable, tangible projects. It's great that we have so many great pledges coming out of COP, but if it doesn't actually translate into tangible, bankable projects on the ground, then we don't really see the impact. And this is where right now we're lagging. And it's unfortunate that these shortfalls in clean investment, clean energy is the largest in the emerging markets that need it the most.
So I'd like to try and draw some themes from across all the speakers. And one of the challenges that I find, and this has been a very broad conversation that has touched on so many obstacles, or things that are making it more difficult to achieve the goals that we'd like in the nearer term. If you were to, and we just had a session that was chaired by Vera Songway, and the Independent High-Level Expert Group has a series of recommendations for the entire finance system architecture, and it is lengthy. And here, all of the opportunities or issues, areas where we could focus again, is it on the carbon markets? Is it through focus on turning the NAPs into an investment plan? Is it through focusing on the existing finance mechanisms of the convention and getting them to be working more efficiently? Is it on swaps? Is it on grants? Is it on the concessional flow of funds that MDBs? It's a lot. But if we're to move at the pace that we need, what are the local, and this is a question for all of you, sorry, long introduction. What are the lower hanging fruits that realistically, if we pushed on those tomorrow, next year, and just prioritize, so that when we come back at COP28, we said, we touched on the things that actually are going to deliver the biggest impact, the biggest bump in the next 12 months. Of all of these things that we've talked about, what would that look like to you? What would you suggest? Let's start at the end.
You know, in events like this, there is a lot of conversations and talk. I think I'd like to refocus my answer in a different way, and that's the fact that Africa took steps before now. One of the ways it decided to take destiny in its hands was through the Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, and where the flagship of that agenda, where we want to see ourselves in 50 years, 2030, is the AFCFTA. FCFTA was a bold statement by political leaders in Africa to take our destiny in hands. So irrespective of what's going on around here, the pledges, we at the bank decided that we will focus on implementation of the AFCFTA. For us, it's already in implementation, it's a low-hanging fruit, and we'll focus on that. Why do I also say that? I think Professor Rama, my boss, said it in an earlier panel, either here or somewhere else, to say that shipping is the third largest contributor of carbon emission. right? Africa's raw materials are shipped outside of the continent to faraway lands, in Asia and Europe, and then they're shipped back again as finished products, and that contributes to carbon emissions. The AFCFTA is an instrument for us that helps us deal with that. In the sense that if we begin to expand our value chains and begin to produce on a continent, that in itself will be a game changer in all of this conversation. We are very high on implementation in Afrexim Bank. Like I said, there's a lot of talk, around here, but we will focus on our pathway, which is on adaptation, focusing on the implementation of the AFCFTA, which we do know will contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gases. And I think in that earlier panel, he talked about the fact that we are under the mandate of the African Union Heads of State, so I'm working with the AFCFTA. We are helping African countries to operationalize an adjustment fund, an AFCFTA adjustment fund, where the transition cost is about $8 to $10 billion, or the adjustment cost, to be able to allow African governments to adjust to the liberalization. And that's an area where we can get help. But we keep going anyway towards, and we think that that's an instrument that needs to be focused on if we're serious about the conversation. Thank you very much.
Okay, so sectoral answer. We now can have another sectoral answer from Siemens. Again, if you were to look at what is going to help your sector move faster than anything else, what are the one or two initiatives, if you look across the continent, that's really going to help the energy sector change fastest?
I would say, first of all the countries are in different phases. South Africa, we talked about coal transition, repurposing those coal plants to renewable programs, and they have this REAP program, which is also a great example that attracted private equity. I think we can learn a lot from the programs that were already made to stimulate new developments. And for me, it's about defining very clearly the tangible energy infrastructure projects needed per country, and moving away from HFO, old, unmodern power plants. That's low-hanging fruit. Just replacing the old with the new and adding new capacity. That's tangible projects, and that's, for me, the most low-hanging fruit. I also do agree with the Pan-African voice that it's important with the African unity, but there's a lot of potential of collaboration between countries, and using this African Free Trade Agreement and developing a climate pact together. I think that would be key with the carbon market aspect, because I think if we can derive incentives and carbon taxes also in line with what is happening with Europe, with the EU taxonomy. However, warning on this is also that we cannot have a situation where EU is imposing or enforcing its own policy on Africa. I think here we need to have the pragmatic approach and understand that it is a transition. We cannot move away from hydrocarbons from one day to another. We need to do everything in parallel. We need to do everything in parallel.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to the Minister very quickly. She has to go. Just final thought.
One low-hanging fruit for Africa, without focusing on a sectoral mechanism, I think it's very important to de-risk the package of private investment in Africa. If we were able to do that, I see that as both as a low-hanging fruit and a long-term enabler. And that could really be done within the perspective of energy transition, nature-based solution, if we would like to change the hat, or even at the level of the small entrepreneurs and how we can join them into that. We need to dig and think, how can we quickly come up within the next 12 months and go to COP28 with a workable, implementable, affordable mechanism for de-risking the private sector in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Excellency, and thank you for joining us today. Remy, the public development banks, AFD, MDBs are in a good position to do that de-risking. Why isn't that particular aspect of the system architecture moving as fast, or is at the scale that everybody that I'm talking to now, de-risking is just, it's a go-to term, it's a go-to idea for so many people. If now we're at the point where this is a place to focus our attention, what is it going to take to actually achieve that?
I mean, public banks are doing their work. I mean, I see a lot of convergence, a lot of goodwill. We really are doing our best. So, and the message from COP21 and the Paris Agreement is now heard loud and clear. So the low-hanging fruit, or what we are expecting for the next 12 months, I think is more about carefully preparing the next COP. Because the COP are so important. I mean, we love, we see, we expect attention in this room because it has consequences on what we are doing. It has consequences on our mandate. And I hope that by COP 28, a new framework, a new architecture, yes, is being defined. This is what we are all waiting for. And this architecture should very clearly, because there's a lot of confusion, identify what are the resources that are needed, well, to finance what nobody will finance. I mean, meaning, is it from the 100 billion? Is it? This is our work from the start. But at the same time, if we create trust enough on this within the negotiation, then please help us do what the minister just said. Help us justify to allocate part of our concessional resources to finance SDGs and climate, to de-risk the private sector, to demultiply. And to be frank, we have no mandate to do that for now. No clear mandate, no KPI, no incentives. So we think that's helpful. So we are doing case by case, little funds, experiments, but it's not a mandate. So the whole, my view is the whole community of the public development banks are asking for this twin mandate. It's not from billion to trillions, it's billions and trillions at the same time. And it's not exactly the same public policy on both sides. So I hope, and I know, well, you heard Prime Minister Mia Mottley, you heard my own President Macron, you heard Secretary Yellen in Washington a few weeks ago. This discussion on the global financial architecture, I think this is the low-hanging fruit. We're not that far. We're not that far. But have clarity, and it goes beyond the old framework of ODA, I think, which is now broken, and what is still unclear in the climate finance framework. We have to reconcile, recombine, do the sum of these two frameworks so that we have maximum capacity to mobilize our balance sheet and our institution. And then convince, of course, our own citizens in our constituency to do more, to recapitalize, to invest, to unlock more grants and concessional resources for international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're running short on time, so Dr. Morsi, I'm going to come to you for the last question again, focusing on this idea of low-hanging fruit, but also what we've been hearing about the need for collective voice. Can Africa come together and identify, given the different circumstances that we've spoken about earlier, can they come together and identify what needs to change in that architecture and how to move it forward in a way that advances their unique needs?
Sure, thank you. We're actually doing that already because we have a high-level working group consisting of African ministers of finance, development, and economy, which ECA hits basically serves as the secretariat and it includes the World Bank, the IMF, and African institutions, African Bank, African Union, and AFDB. And we have been, this has been established in February. We've been meeting regularly, and we've put forward a number of asks, including many of the issues that we've been talking about. If I were to identify kind of the, some of the low-hanging fruits, it would be, for example, increasing the funding for the Resilience and Sustainability Trust and the IMF, which actually have this opportunity to tackle climate change issues with long-term financing. So if we can increase that and broaden the eligibility to include mid-income countries, that would be helpful. But then I think I really agree with my colleagues here about the issue of the de-risking. This is vital. It's a low-hanging fruit, and it's also necessary for a number of things we talked about to bring, the debt for nature swap or debt for climate swaps, to bring them to scale. We actually need credit enhancements. We need guarantees to move from the millions to billions, to bring the private sector, which is fundamental. Currently, the private sector represents less than 14% of the climate financing that we need in Africa. And we need the private sector we need to crowd in the private sector. That will come through de-risking, more credit enhancement tools, guarantees, first loss guarantees. These are the type of things that will be needed. But to do that, this is where we need also the MDBs, and where actually a number of things can be done to help them. For example, increasing their capitalization, enhancing or channeling the SDR through MDBs to have the leverage of 3 to 4 times what these SDRs can do, and then also to increase the risk-taking on their balance sheets. All that will, help a great deal for what we're talking about. Finally, I think this is not something that will happen in the short term, but it's essential if we need to fix the global architecture, which is fixing the carbon credit pricing. This will be essential for the continent, and to have a just system, we need to work on that. ECA has been working with the Congo Basin to help with carbon registry and harmonized protocols to increase the integrity of the market, and we need to really keep pushing on that and keep pushing until we have a fair pricing of it to benefit Africa. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I don't want to be the moderator that completely blows the schedule for the presidents on Finance Day, so I'm going to bring this session to a close. Thank you to our panel very much. So many ideas have been discussed today. I think this notion of if we were to come back next year, were we able to make progress on these low-hanging fruit? Were we able to speak with a collective voice? I think those are the questions that we need to keep asking ourselves, but I really appreciate your teeing them up for us today, so thank you very much, and thank you.